there's reporting, analytics, machine learning, and data security and privacy, of course, as it is today. And I also organized a meetup in Miami. Unfortunately, when all this pandemic started, never got to have a physical meeting for the Miami meetup. We'll see when we can meet in person again, once things go back to normal or as close to it. We are on Meetup. You can find us there. And I'll also be sharing a link to our Discord server where you can get in touch, ask questions, and talk to other people that are interested in data. And lastly, I wanted to make a quick announcement about Data Basement. It is a podcast that I host that has topics related to, same as the meetups, data analytics, reporting, security, etc. So you can check it out. There'll be a new episode releasing this week that is all about using threat intelligence data to be able to create better cybersecurity insurance policies, or to be able to underwrite cybersecurity insurance policies better. So check that out. And on that note, we'll go ahead and kick it off and welcome our speaker today. The speaker today is Claire Bowen, and she is a lead data scientist of privacy and data security at the Urban Institute. She develops and researches data privacy algorithms that can create synthetic versions of confidential data, such as income tax data, in order to drive better policy. And her other interests include statistical computing, scientific communication, as well as STEM outreach. Thank you for joining us today, Claire, and welcome to the meetup.
Thank you for having me. So I need to first make sure we're sharing the right screen, and can everyone see that? All right, I see some nodding heads. So awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Again, I'm Claire Bowen, and I am very excited to be talking about data privacy. And I say in the real world because it seems like a lot of times either people have a misunderstanding of what area of data privacy I'm working in, or they think it's all theory and it isn't at all practical. So I'm going to walk through what I mean by privacy, what are the applications, and what are the continuing challenges. So again, here's an overview, motivation, what is privacy and why should we care, background on what has been done in both the computer science and statistics. So actually I'm trained with a statistics background, and the viewpoints of statisticians towards their privacy and confidentiality is actually very different than with computer science. So I'm actually going to step through how those two viewpoints how they differ and how they are the same and what are their goals. I'm going to go do some little bit of methodology, so don't worry, there are very minimum equations. I am a big fan of very little to no equation presentations. So if you see one, it's just to give a little bit more background, but you can just ignore those and just look at the pretty pictures I made. So just emphasizing that. And then going into what I said earlier, which is the ongoing challenges and some of the exciting applications that we're seeing in government specifically. So, and at the end, I would like to have an open discussion. So I actually will pause briefly in between parts of my talk to give a moment for anybody who has questions. If you're lost, feel free to engage. I'm really excited to be presenting today. So now, motivation. What is privacy and why should you care? Well, actually, back in 2018, data privacy came to the public light with the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook. And funny enough, this scandal happened 2 days before I defended my dissertation. And some people thought, well, Claire, how does this change your work? And I told them, well, it doesn't change the focus or the importance of it. It just makes it easier to explain to people why it is important. So with Facebook Analytica scandal, it really came to question as to who has the right to collect our data and who should be monitoring maybe these third-party entities like Facebook to disseminate that information. And so it gets really scary, especially when you get other articles like this one. This got published back in December of 2019, so not too long ago, about how just our cell phone information is is enough to figure out our patterns, and it can disclose some very sensitive information. So you thought Facebook was sensitive because maybe your mom liked a little too much of your posts and saying, hey sweetie, I remember back when you were in high school, I cheered for you, and all these other things. You're like, oh, that's embarrassing. But at least with the cell phone data, it's going to target where you live, and what are your habits, where you work. Maybe you have kids because maybe you stop by school. So this gets really invasive. And so some people think, okay, well, what if we just remove people's personally identifiable information, or PIIs is what you'll commonly hear, like their names, their social security numbers, their addresses, things like that. And you think, okay, this data is super safe. Well, the data that the New York Times obtained didn't have the person's name or where they specifically lived, but they figured out that there was somebody who lived in the Redmond area of Washington and probably worked at Microsoft, because they would frequently be tracked and located at Microsoft campus during working hours. And they figured out this pattern of like what times he liked to go, what time he liked to leave. And then finally, they noticed something a little different. He went to the Amazon campus one afternoon. Well, they identified this person and found out that he was a software engineer, and he did a job interview at Amazon. And sure enough, 2 months later, he switched over and was now working on their warehouse robots, I believe. That's what they say in the article. So this also gets a little creepy, because you think, well, what is going to stop my employers from knowing my behavior and my habits? Maybe they would fire me early. So again, that gets really creepy. And people are also thinking, really, we shouldn't be collecting this data. This is really bad. Well, now I'm going to give you an argument as to why we need to still disseminate this very important data. So these are actually some articles I pulled up today. When I give similar talks, I try to get some like very relevant examples, and there happens to be an article posted today about there is lack of public data that's going to hamper our ability to fight COVID-19. So there are companies that want to use our cell phone tracking data to figure out, well, contact tracing. If somebody tests positive for COVID-19, we should want to backtrace where they've been, who they've been contacted with. Maybe we could have this app that says, hey, somebody who you were in close proximity with within so much feet tested positive earlier today. You might want to consider getting tested or quarantine and stay away from certain individuals who are at higher risk. And so with this, maybe we can start reopening the country. Maybe we would not be in so much fear. And then in the meantime, waiting for the vaccine. Other reasons, going back to both the Facebook and the New York Times cell phone data, what can you use that data for? Well, there's been research showing that certain ways that we tweet or how we post on Facebook can identify people who have certain mental illnesses, and how we can target that and help give them the resources to get better. For the cell phone data, we can use that to be better with our first respondents. So what if we have, since you guys are all from Florida, hurricanes, right? That's a big deal. So figuring out what are the typical traffic patterns within your state, and figure out which roads should be closed and which ones shouldn't, in order to expedite people to leave the city or certain areas of the state. So this is the issue with, like, how do you balance the need for the privacy of the individuals who contributed to the data, but at the same time provide enough information to those who need it to do data for good. And so I'm going back a little bit as to why this is a very hard problem. And so you kind of hear this like balance between the usefulness, or what we say sometimes the utility of the data, as well as the privacy. And so again, I'm going to say, why is removing the personally identifiable information, or PIs, not enough? Well, we live in an information age an age of information technology, right? We have these little phones in our pockets that are basically mini computers that are more powerful than they were 10 years ago. And so we're collecting data more rapidly than ever. So in this example here, it's a little dated, it's from 2013, but I like this example because right now we're going to have the election coming up. So this group over at Harvard took some voter data. So it's data that I personally think is not that really important. I don't care if people know what my party affiliation. Okay, well, maybe some people do care about that, since that's a little more heated, but I don't care that they know I'm registered or have this other information, but that's enough to overlap with what was called the Personal Genome Project over at Harvard, where they're collecting more medical information to try to figure out personalized medicine. That was the goal of this Personal Genome Project. And just using a very small voter database, this research group also at Harvard, was able to identify 130 individuals just with that data set, and they were able to identify more with other data sets. And so this is very terrifying that just enough overlapping information can disclose who is in that more sensitive data. So what can we do to tackle this? Because we can't just shut down the data. We already know that it's really important for data for good. At least that's what I term it, because I'm from nonprofit. But at the same time, privacy of individuals. So in statistics, we do more what's called a non-interactive sanitizer, meaning that, well, we have the user and the raw data and we can't have them direct access. So what we do is we take the raw data and put it into some sort of mechanism or algorithm that will alter the results of the data set, what we call like a synthetic data. So you'll sometimes hear synthetic data generation or creating a statistically representative data set that's fake. Statistically representative of the original data that is fake. And so what are kind of some examples of that? So I'm actually raised in Idaho, and I will be using this example a lot because I grew up in a very rural area of Idaho where there was 3,000 people and we had all 2 stoplights in the county, and the county was the size of Connecticut. So just for scope, and 3,000 people, that was the biggest town. So it would be great if we could report the data down to every individual person, but you can imagine growing up in a very small town, identifying me as being a small Asian woman in a very predominantly Caucasian state is not really good for my privacy. So we're going to put this data set through this mechanism, and we're going to report down to what most data sets do, like down to the county level. And so this actual, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but I'm kind of circling around the more highlighted county. That's the county I grew up, Lemhi County. And again, it's about just barely smaller than the size of Connecticut, just for scope here. And so we can, what was called aggregation. So you can just aggregate the number of people who live in that county, who have certain, or who is in a certain age group, gender, income, and so on and so forth. And so aggregation is one technique on developing a synthetic data set. Other ones are, these are a little older ones, but you can do top and bottom coding, meaning that you would only report an income of at most, maybe say 100,000, or at as small as 25,000. So that's top and then bottom, and things like that, or rounding, so on and so forth. So you can imagine all these different techniques. The biggest drawback of this non-interactive sanitizer is that trying to quantify how much privacy is being preserved, or what is the risk, without making assumptions about how somebody might attack that data. So in the literature, everybody has to make this assumption of like, okay, I'm going to assume the data adversary, data intruder, or data attacker, you'll hear those terms used interchangeably, is going to find somebody or maybe a group of people, and what kind of information they're trying to gather. Are trying to identify people like me who live in Lemhi County, or they're trying to find a certain income bracket, or are they just trying to find enough overlapping information with an external data set and just to see if they can link it to something more sensitive? And so you can imagine that this makes it very hard to evaluate the true risk of the data. Now over to computer science. So they do what's more called an interactive sanitizer. And so instead of just putting the data through a mechanism and getting a fake data set, you have some sort of interface. So there's some medium in between the data user and the data itself, and they'll submit queries. So let's say the question is, what is the average income? So the query gets posed into the interface, which accesses the database. And then it figure out the answer. So maybe the average income for this particular data set is 85,000. But the interface is like, okay, we need to change this a little bit, can't report the true answer. So it's going to be 90,000. And so most people think, wow, this is great, right? There's a median between the user and the data. What could possibly be wrong with this? Well, one of the issues is like trying to figure out how much, what we say, noise should be added to the data. Is 5,000 enough? Do we actually need to do 10,000? Or maybe 5,000 is too much. Maybe we're adding too much noise to the data unnecessarily. We can get something closer, like maybe saying it's 87,000. That way we get more accuracy and more informative information from the data for the user. Now, the other thing is, like, how should you limit the queries being submitted to the database? So let's just say that the clever data user here decided that, okay, I really want to be more targeted. And so my follow-up question is, how much does Claire's income deviate from the average? So then in 2 questions, my privacy gets violated. So there's other issues too, but you just with those 2, you can understand that why there's some issues with this interactive sanitizer. And so I'm going to go into what is called differential privacy. And this is actually my specialty area, and it's a very hot topic right now. Microsoft, Google, Apple, Uber, LinkedIn, more and more other big name tech companies are all saying that they're using differential privacy. It's the future. This is how we're going to protect our data that we disseminate. And also the US Census Bureau. So if you, let's just say you're totally off the grid, which makes me kind of wonder why you're part of these high ladies and coders and things like that. Anyways, just hypothetically assume that you're completely off the grid and you're like, hey, I don't use Google Chrome. I don't have a LinkedIn account. I don't even use, I am running Ubuntu and I'm just not nailing anything with Microsoft. But if you live in the United States, the US Census Bureau has announced that for the 2020 decennial census, they're going to be using differential privacy on their data. So this is very important and why it's affect all of us. So I said there I was going to have very little equations. This is just for reference. This is the definition of differential privacy. So there's a couple things I just want you to highlight or understand, is that when you hear somebody say differential privacy, it is not a method. It is not an algorithm. Differential privacy is a mathematical definition that a method, mechanism, algorithm, or so forth must satisfy to be considered differentially private. So I'm emphasizing this because there's a lot of really smart people who are in this field or tangentially related to this field who still keep saying differential privacy is a method, and that's false. So in order to explain this definition, this mathematical definition, I'm going to use little friendly pictures here. So like I said, you can just focus on these. So what is so groundbreaking with differential privacy that all these big tech companies are adopting and saying, this is how we're going to disseminate data, this is how we're going to protect people's privacy? Well, one of the big things I wanted you to take away from differential privacy is that unlike previous methods, it actually quantifies and figures out how much privacy is being used or leaked in the data set with using an epsilon. So you'll commonly hear epsilon being called the privacy budget. So I'm going to back up a little bit. And so it's the amount, again, of privacy being leaked. So how should we interpret this? So if epsilon is large, you're leaking more information. So you can kind of think of it as like money amount, which I was saying privacy budget. So just imagine that, okay, I don't care if people know that I love dogs. I have 2 dogs, love them, great. So I'm okay with more information being leaked about that. So I'm going to give up $10 of my privacy because that's okay. I don't care. So that means that we're going to gain, or excuse me, I said $10 privacy, $10 of my information. So if you're willing to leak more information, that means you're going to have less privacy because they oppose one another, okay? So larger epsilon means more information, opposite, less privacy. I'm going to keep emphasizing those over and over because people still get confused, and that's okay. So if epsilon is small, that means we're leaking less information. So let's say I really don't want people to know if I have HIV or cancer or something more sensitive, then I want to set epsilon as small as possible. It can't be 0 because that means you basically don't release any information. So it's a non-zero value. So meaning less information, more privacy. Okay, so that sounds really weird. You're thinking, Claire, that's still really confusing. I want to look at the pretty pictures and figure out what's going on. So here are pretty pictures. I'm going to have our data user who's thinking, okay, how many people are from Idaho who is attending this meetup? So just imagine that our data set is everybody who's attending this meetup. Those are like with information as gender, where we're from, so on and so forth. So the question the person's posing is how many people are from Idaho? I'm going to safely assume I'm the one here that's originally from Idaho. And if you say that you are, then I'm going to say from people from Salmon, Idaho, because I'm pretty sure no one's from there. So anyways, let's say I'm super embarrassed that I'm from Idaho. I don't want anybody to know So I'm going to set epsilon to be 1. So again, small epsilon means less information. So the question gets posed into this interface that has a mechanism that satisfies differential privacy. And so what differential privacy does is that it looks 2 versions of the data set, a data set with me in it and a data set without me in it. So the data set with me in it says there is 1 person here who's attending this talk that's from Idaho. The data set without me says there's none. And so trying to figure out, okay, the difference is only 1. We need to add some noise there. So we're going to say there's 10 people total of this whole meetup who are from Idaho. Now you who is receiving this information is thinking, okay, that's really weird because that's a lot of people from Idaho, and this is a Florida-based meetup talk. So maybe the noise being added is 10 because it's probably 0. But maybe, I mean, there's a non-zero probability, so maybe it is 1, so the noise being added is 9. Or, well, maybe that person had a friend, and maybe some family members. And then, so you can see why, in order to protect my privacy, we have to add way more noise to that answer, because then it kind of questions like that, whoever's trying to attack it, it's like, actually, how much specifically noise is being added? Now, what if we set our privacy budget to be larger, 10? After all, I already told you I'm from Idaho. I said it's going to be a motivating, kind of like helpful example throughout my talk. Then we set it as 10. And so what happens to that? Well, in this case, we actually get the right answer. And actually these values, I used a differentially private algorithm to get the results. And so since we set the epsilon value to be pretty high, or the privacy budget to be high, we're going to get a lot of information. In this case, the actual true answer. So we're going to go into some methodology here thinking, okay, Claire, that was great. You explained non-interactive, like rating of synthetic data. You also talked about computer science, what they use, the query-based system. And now you talked about this other query-based system called differential privacy, this kind of mathematical definition. So what is actually being done? That's all still math. You want to know what's actually happening. Well, right now, the popular approach in all those tech companies and in government is to not only have the raw data and the data user, you have what we sometimes call the data curator or the data maintainer, the person who owns the data, who knows whether the unique features of that particular data set. So I'm a statistician, so we're going to call it statistics instead of queries. And so you pose those statistics or queries to the data set, try to highlight those features, and then put those answers into a mechanism that satisfies differential privacy, but also produces a synthetic data set. And so this seems like really great because you create a data set with a preset privacy guarantee that the data user can use however they want. Awesome. So what are the ways to do this? Well, you can kind of hear, or excuse me, you'll often see roughly like 2 categories that people will try to generate the synthetic data with differential privacy. So we're just going to break down to data synthesis. So this is a very popular approach that has existed for a few decades. So we're going to just use this example here. Bear with me. So along the x-axis, imagine it's income, and then the y-axis is the number of individuals. So let's say this is our original data. So a non-parametric approach is what sometimes we call looking at the marginal tables, or a histogram, or so on and so forth, however people refer it. And basically, you're just going to do random sampling to generate your synthetic data. So this is a very common approach. Say like, oh, maybe there was 10 individuals in this bar, but when we do random sampling, it ends up becoming 8. So that's how the privacy protection comes in, is that the kind of this randomness from just sampling. Now for differential privacy, you're going to have to add additional amount of noise with a differentially private mechanism. So what does that mean? So when I said, what if one of these bars has 10 people and that represents 5% of the data? Well, 5% is the true value. Well, we're going to add a little bit noise from a differentially private mechanism. And then you're going to get something like, let's say 7%. And then you're going to make a random draw. So you're going to add additional noise there. And I realized I forgot to pause earlier before I went to the methodology. So I'm going to pause right now. Does anybody have any questions so far? Have I lost anybody? It's okay if you don't have questions either, because if you're like me, sometimes I have to think a little bit to figure out my questions.
I do have a question.
Ooh, excellent.
So when you're talking about a person setting their privacy value, the epsilon, do you mean an individual actually choosing like first name and an address in some sort of interface?
Oh, that is a good question. So if I understand right, like how do we set this epsilon? Is it a person who decides it or somebody else? So this is actually an open-ended social public policy question that is highly debated among the scientists. Some people say the people who participate in the data should be able to set what epsilon is. Scientists say, no, we shouldn't do that because people don't understand what are the actual ramifications or the theory behind differential privacy. What is epsilon? And some other people say, well, it should be decided by the federal government and voted on Congress because we need somebody to actually shoulder the consequence of, let's say they set epsilon to be 5 and they found out that was not low enough. That was too high. We released too much information. So who's going to take the blame here? Congress. So you can see it from there. It's very unfortunate that this has not been researched more, but it's actually one of the proposals I have written up to see if we can explore this as more of a social public policy question. Does that answer that person's question, hopefully?
Yes, thank you very much.
Awesome. Any more questions? Concerns? Criticisms? Complaints? All right, we're going to keep going then. All right, so this is a non-parametric approach. There's other non-parametric approaches, but I like this one because everybody has seen a histogram, usually somewhere in undergrad. Parametric approach. Okay, so basically parametric approach is a model-based approach. So if you can identify a model correctly for the data, you can generate synthetic data from it. So in this case here, height is relatively normally distributed, right? Or Gaussian distribution, whatever term that you're familiar with. So along the x-axis here is height, and y-axis again is the number of individuals. And so we can say, this roughly looks like a normal distribution. So one way to generate synthetic data is to identify the appropriate probability distribution, and you make kind of draws from that distribution. So in this case, it's normal. So let's say the average height, I think for women is 5'4", standard deviation is probably 2 inches. So then we're going to make draws, and you're going to get something close, but it's a little different. With differential privacy, you have to figure out what is the essential information that I need from that model, and I'm going to have to alter that value. So you have to do additional noise. In statistics, we call it the sufficient statistics. So in the case of a normal distribution, it is you need to know the mean, and you need to know the standard deviation or the variance. And so you have to alter those. So instead of saying the average height of a woman is 5'4" in the United States, maybe it's 5'3". And then for the standard errors, same way, or standard deviation, excuse me. And so we kind of think, okay, again, Claire, awesome. Differential privacy is going to solve all problems. Big tech companies are all for it. The Census Bureau is behind it. Okay, what could possibly be wrong? All right, so some of the drawbacks are, for non-parametric approaches, it actually doesn't preserve the variability of the data very well. It actually gets what we call the estimates, or the average, within maybe the box or the height of your histogram, but the variability swings drastically, especially when you have more and more combinations, as you can imagine, for a certain data set. So what we looked at was just what we call univariate. But imagine you have a data set like the decennial census, which has multiple questions, and there's different answers within those questions, and you have to look at all those combinations, and you're thinking, okay, crazy. The next one is it has some bias issues, especially if you have sparsity. So for those who are more familiar with a lot of data cleaning, you have to imagine that, let's look at different kind of variables. So I'm going to look at gender, age, let's say location and income. And so if you just look at gender and age, maybe the possible combinations only come out to 10, because you have male, female, other identification, and then for age, it's just groupings of less than 18 or older 18, because we're thinking about voting. So that's only 6 combinations. That's all I have to think about. So preserving probably the usefulness of the data is not going to be too hard. But then when you have different income levels or where they're located, there's 50 states and all the different counties, then you can get into the millions of different combinations with only a few thousand observations. So that becomes one of the issues. For parametric, it is one of the drawbacks. It's model dependent. And so I have been hinting at this, but I haven't explicitly said that if you're going to use a differentially private mechanism, every time you query or have a statistic, you have to cut up epsilon. You have to cut up your budget. So again, smaller epsilon means less information. So if your model has like 20 different parameters or 20 different things that you need to put into it, that means you have to divide your budget into 20 little pieces in order to create a differentially private synthetic data set. So that's not great either. So you have to imagine what kind of model you have to do. Also, there's some issues in literature about model selection. So obviously height is a normal distribution, but what if you have a more complex data set where you have to use the data to figure out the model? Well, that's leaking information, the model that you pick. So there's actually research onto how do you have a differentially private model selector, which is crazy, right? So now to the second point, which I didn't go into too much detail because I didn't want to get us too deep in the weeds, which is trying to figure out the global sensitivity is difficult to calculate. So what do I mean by global sensitivity? It's like how robust your statistic or query is to the absent or presence of somebody. And so I kind of hinted at it with myself being like, okay, if Claire's in the data set or not in the data set, how much does the query will change and how much noise we have to add? So if we think of income, and again with Meetup here, so let's say the question is, what is the median income? And you have to think of the most extreme global person. So that's why it's called global sensitivity. So currently the richest person in the world is Jeff Bezos. I looked him up. He beat Bill Gates this last 2 years. So it's now Jeff Bezos. So if he was in our Meetup group and he was out of it, if we were just looking at median income, it shouldn't change too much. But if the question was, what's the maximum income? And if he was in our Meetup and then he left our Meetup, the answer would drastically change. So we have to add a lot more noise to protect that particular kind of question. And then, so this last point, I already said it before, which is it's not very scalable because we are going to get more and more parameters. So some challenges. I'm going to pause again. Any questions, concerns, criticisms, complaints, quandaries?
Okay, so maybe a question for the tax returns, which you mentioned at the beginning that you're working on, where with something like the census, you may have a particular geographical area that may have disproportionate income brackets, and ultimately the census is trying to both ideally understand what are the needs of different communities. And based on what you just described, one of the challenges that gets highlighted is that if, let's say, a minority of the population in that particular geographical area has a lower income or is disadvantaged, then they could potentially not get counted, and the required resources for that particular area could be overlooked, and they wouldn't get the schools they need or the public resources that they need. So I guess, I don't know if you're going to go over into during your presentation or not, but how have you had to deal with that particular challenge so far?
So that is a very good question. It's actually something a colleague and I wrote a brief op-ed about, and it's to be published. We've actually finally wrote it, but it kind of goes into, I think, not that slide. So to answer your question of, we called inequality or the unequal cost of privacy is what we titled our op-ed. And so unfortunately, the way that we are traditionally have been doing our data privacy methods really affect underrepresented groups or marginalized groups. And it affects them in two ways. So I'm going to use me as an example again, because I grew up in Idaho. I love my state, but it is very much predominantly Caucasian. And I was the only Asian in high school. Like, let's put that perspective here. Like the only Asian student in the whole high school. And so in order to make sure, like in the census count that I'm counted, I should accurately report that I'm Asian, I'm located in Lemhi County of Idaho. But because I'm the only one, traditional methods will say we can't report that. So there's two effects to that. One is that if there was going to be any benefits to happen for that county, it's going to be targeted based on the majority. So the minorities are going to be left out. And then two, let's just say, okay, the first one, that's bad. It's like, no, we need to help the underrepresented groups, so we should actually report the values. Well, if you report the values, then now everybody knows it's me. because I'm the only Asian in that area of Lemhi County. And so you get this polarizing effect of like, you either help people at a cost of extreme cost of their privacy, or you don't help them at all and just assume they're just like the majority. And so I'm going to highlight this more on some of the challenges, and then we can go into a deeper discussion, but that, unfortunately, that's actually how things work. And there's not enough research in the area on how should we tackle those who are either, let's say, in the lower percent of income, who have a certain race, gender, or so on and so forth, that makes it very identifiable. So this slide here, it just has a picture of a person looking at data. The reason I have this up is talking about accessibility. And what I mean by accessibility is not just, do we have code to implement these methods? It's also just understanding what the problems are, what is being done right now in the field, broadly when I say field, like the whole field. So it's not just statisticians and computer scientists, they're economists, social scientists, and others who are trying to access this very important data for their own research. And so they need to know what is being affected to their data, because actually some people I talk to say they think they get the raw data that's unaltered, and you try to explain to them like, no, it's one, usually it's not, or two, maybe you did get something really close to the raw data, but now technology has changed so much, because going back to the little tiny computers in our pockets, the average smartphone is more powerful than our desktops from 10 years ago. Like, it's crazy. So just by sheer computing power, we can probably identify quite a bit of people. And that was why census had to change from what the methods they did in 2010 to 2020, because they figured out they could identify, it was like over 90% of people. So that's scary. We're going to continue on here. So what should we do? So this is a blog post I wrote back in March, trying to make it more accessible for people, trying to outreach a little bit, saying, hey, these are the problems, these are the issues, because this was actually in response to a New York Times op-ed about how census was going to race a rural America. And this blog post I wrote in response saying, it's not as easy as saying like, how dare census does this? It's like, well, one, census needs to take a step back and think about what are the ramifications, but this is why they decide to do this. It's because individuals like myself, who, let's say I was still in Idaho, it would be really easy to find me. And maybe some people think, okay, well, being Asian, that's not anything special. But I don't think people realize that the lingering effects, so let's say, of World War II, right? There was that big scandal with Census Bureau in World War II. Well, did you know that there was an internment camp in Idaho? So that has those kind of effects. So if I was Japanese descent, that would make me very, very uncomfortable. So we need to have more of these open conversations and having these written materials so that people can understand what is going on, what is their privacy being used for, or excuse me, their data used for, and how are we protecting their privacy. And then going back to some of the code. So people are not going to adopt something so new, like differential privacy, for instance, unless there's code, because people, like, in essence, I mean, I'm like this too, are lazy. So it'd be great if we had some Python code, like some libraries from Python or R, so on and so forth. I think this group is also looking at Rust. So this group is started from the Sloan Foundation in partnership with Microsoft, and they're being housed in Harvard, where they're trying to do a whole open source suite of different tools using differential privacy. So that way, lots of people can access, figure out, assess which method is best for them, and then make it easier for them to deploy on their data. And especially because this big push for open source. So like no paywalls, no nothing. You can all freely access this materials. So now getting to one of the points is, okay, Claire, again, you're kind of vaguely explaining what's going on in real world. I want some exact examples here. So I'm going to be talking about two projects that I've been working at the Urban Institute. One is on looking at how to optimize, as the title says, optimizing data to advance rural development. And I'm going to pause momentarily. Does people have any questions, concerns, complaints, criticisms before I go on to my real world examples? Okay, so I don't see any. All right, so this is actually a picture of the town I grew up in called Salmon. That's literally the whole town of 3,000 people. Anyways, so I thought that was a great example of something that what we consider rural. And so just going to give you some background like why we're looking at this problem. So why isn't there more target rural economic development? In particular, let's just say, again, we're going to go data user here. What is the question? What is the average wage for the restaurant industry in Salmon, Idaho? This is actually a pretty important question because we had COVID-19 came through, really destroyed the restaurant industry. And so we're trying to figure out like, okay, how can we be more targeted with our stimulus package to help those in need, such as in the service industry. And so the kind of data you would want to get is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're the ones who collect all the information on like who's in certain industries and which locations, and so on and so forth. And so this data set in particular that actually gathers that information is called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. So again, it goes down to the facility or firm. I think they actually call it firm. I don't know why they call it firm. I think of like institution or facility that you're in. The area of your employment. So it's like there's education, health, and engineering, and there's like other levels. So specific ones, and then it'll report your wages for those individuals. So awesome. It would be totally great to get just the raw data down to each individuals, but again, there's big privacy concerns. So what currently BLS does is that they report it down to the county level, and I mentioned this before, that's pretty common to go down to the county, it's aggregated. But there's a big issue with this if you're trying to be more targeted with your stimulus package, because if your question is how many people are in Salmon, Idaho needs the, or what's the average wage for a restaurant worker in Salmon, Idaho, well, that county is the size of Connecticut. And so how are you going to figure out in the size of Connecticut, like where you should be targeted of your stimulus package? So one county level, Lemhi County, question mark. That's not good. So the problem we're trying to figure out is there a better way to improve the quality of the data while still maintaining privacy? Because the methods that BLS is still using is actually considered very dated. So we're actually looking at two different levels, doing just data synthesis. So can we synthesize the data down to a smaller geography? It's not down to individual because that's very sensitive. So let's see if we can do it down to the census tract level. And then maybe we can also try to do a layer of differential privacy. So actually census tract 9703 is the one that I lived in. And so that's a lot better than just the whole county. So again, this is what we're doing is we're going to test out, can we do synthetic data generation and also synthetic generation with differential privacy and see what are the trade-offs between the utility and the privacy and see if we could do better than what's currently being done. Any questions so far?
Just given that example about policy and using the statistics to be able to determine things like economic stimulus, could you elaborate? I'm personally not very familiar with this process, but could you elaborate at how quantitative is the policy making today? And is it not quantitative enough because of what you said, that there's not enough data sources, or is there a more systemic problem that policymakers are not, let's say, using the available resources to calculate these things better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was actually in discussion on a panel I was on last week, actually. It was featuring public policy with data privacy. And so traditionally, or I shouldn't say traditionally, in the past, policymakers were like, this is a technical nerdy thing. Let's leave it to the technical nerdy people. They'll figure it out. They make the best judgments. But now as we're moving forward into this technological age and everybody is trying to get more involved, and there's now these bigger ramifications that, let's just say, for instance, my desktop actually is a little bit souped up. And so with my desktop alone, I could probably figure out some of the people in the older technique methods or identify people. So given this invasion of like both the potential for the average Joe to figure out somebody in a data set, and the fact that policymakers are realizing like, oh, we can't just leave it to just the scientists. People need to have a voice as well. There's this cultural shift into, okay, we need to have a better conversation, we need to have a reevaluation, but it's still government, so things still take quite a bit of time. So working with people at BLS, for instance, a lot of them know that what they're doing isn't enough, that they need to update their methods, but it's slow to change because they have to first convince the funders. So in this case, it's the US government. And then they have the internal politics of also trying to figure out, okay, so this method doesn't work, but before we jump ship to a new one, we need to figure out internally, do we have enough manpower to do this? Do we have enough computational resources? So on and so forth. So I guess that was, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. But one of the things I do want to highlight is that a lot of the federal government agencies, their infrastructure is not as good. We already saw that with the stimulus package, trying to get our stimulus checks, where I think IRS, like some parts run on Cobalt. So you're just kind of like, well, that's not good. I've heard of Cobalt still running in some areas because like some of the larger machines are so old, but too expensive to replace, that that's why they run it. But it's still horrifying to think that a lot of these important systems like delivering unemployment is still running on Cobalt and not something more modern. But part of it's because of their limitations. And actually, when I was actually at the Census Bureau for a little bit, and one of the things that we talked about was that the cluster we had access to was pretty small. And that was because Census said, hey, we are a data product provider. We don't do a lot of internal research. There are researchers there, but it's not the big focus. Focus is collecting and collecting data and disseminating that out to the people for certain projects. And so for somebody higher up who said, hey, we need to soup up, we need to be more up to date, like what is one of the big things we need to do? And one of the things that the researcher brought up was like, our cluster is tiny. We can't we can't do some of the simulations that we need to do to figure out what techniques we need to apply to the data set. Does that answer the question? I might have wandered a little bit. All right, thumbs up. Okay, so we're going to move on to this much bigger project, which I'm just going to do very highlight here because it's a massive undertaking. It's going to take over a decade to fully complete, but it is very important. So figuring out ways that we can generate synthetic data on certain parts of the tax data, right? It's obviously very sensitive here. So it's massive undertaking. So this is just the Urban team, and this is the list of collaborators with myself and every else in between. And then these are our other collaborators from other places, like, of course, the IRS, Mathematica, Rice, JCT, Treasury, and this is just like a sample. There's actually far more people who are involved. And so I just want to highlight this fact that these big projects like this need big collaborations. And so wondering, okay, you mentioned you're working on tax data, what are you calling it? So our first step was to be like, okay, tax data is actually very complicated, so let's try something very simple. Let's take a part of the tax data called the non-filer data, and we're going to call it the supplemental public use file. So what is that and why do we care? Okay, so Urban Institute, Tax Brooking, and a bunch of other nonprofit research organizations use what they call tax microsimulation models. That's also big words. What do I mean by that? Anytime you hear, let's say, the presidential debates saying like, my tax plan is going to do this, we're going to do Medicare for all, or universal healthcare, excuse me, and so on and so forth. How do they know how effective those are going to be? So places like Urban Institute have a tax model where they take public use files, so tax data that's been altered, that IRS supplies them, to simulate the tax plans that the presidential candidates have. And it's not just presidential candidates, but right now, since we're 2020 and we have election coming up, this is a really good example. And so they'll say, okay, this is the output, this is how it's going to affect Joe, Jan, whatever, within certain income brackets. So the supplemental public use file is just a subset of people who are considered non-filer. And we're going to also put them under those microsimulation models to figure out what are these, how are they going to be affected by taxes? And so why start with non-filers? It's more uniform. It's not as crazy complex because this data is like people who did not file or did not have a requirement to file, but we still have their tax information. So they're pretty like uniform across. And this is based on continuous work history sample, which is another internal database. And it is a 10 in 9,999. Oh goodness, so just say 1 in 1,000, excuse me, sample of information. So it's a smaller file too. It's about, I think it was like 17,000 people in that data set. And so again, you have to measure the usefulness of the data, and also the what sometimes you hear disclosure risks or the privacy issues. And so just giving you a couple terms, one of the things that we looked at was general utility. So it's whether the synthetic data has a distribution that's comparable to the original. So you're trying to compare those similar features, just re-emphasizing what I said earlier. Specific utility is like if you have a specific analysis that you want on the synthetic data, and that'd be similar to original. So in this case for Urban Institute, they want to make sure their micro simulation models outputs are very similar, because you don't want to say that this candidate says that their tax plan is going to affect the average American, it's going to increase their taxes, but then the micro simulation model says it's not, but it turns out it will. You're going to get a lot of angry people yelling at you. So you still want to have fairly accurate results from those models. Now on the disclosure side, because you're trying to, again, balance the usefulness of data and the privacy. So identity as disclosure is one type of risk that we have to look at, which is when a person is linked to a particular record or released statistic. So it says release table, but it could be any release statistic. So being able to identify Claire in Idaho is one way to think of it. Attribute disclosure is when you try to gain new information about those individuals after it's released. So that kind of that linkage there where I said like, oh, okay, there's an external data set, we're going to get additional attributes. So like medication, maybe linking with your voter data. It's one way to think of it. Okay, so how do we generate the synthetic data? So I'm going to give a little bit more specifics as the process on this just specific supplemental file. So we actually used a CART model, which is a classification or regression tree on the confidential data. And so some of the variables we looked at, or that's part of this data set, is the gender, the age, and wages, and so on. And we just ran the model to figure out how it's going to get broken down. And now for some of the questions are like, okay, well, if you do that, don't you get down to like specific people? And so that's where you have to, what we call smooth out the results. So you might have to round people a little bit, move them to a different bin, things like that, because of these disclosure risks. So that's a whole other detailed discussion, but that's just like a high level overview of what we did. And now what was the quality? Which I realized I covered the Q, so it looks quality. So, oops. So this is on the mean. So the y-axis here is the different variables, and the x-axis is the mean wages. And so the yellow is the synthetic data results, and then the blue is the original data. So we actually got pretty close. That's not too bad. This is for the standard deviation, because some people think, oh, the estimate is more important, knowing what the average is, but you need to also know how much does it vary. So we see that it's not too bad. It's a little bit more deviant, especially tax exempt interest is a bigger gap, but still not too bad. This is actually a result on one of the tax simulation models that we ran. So x-axis is what we wanted to predict, which was the average AGI. So that's, I always forget this, aggregated gross income. And then the y-axis for the first one is the number of people within each of the bins. And then for the middle one, it's the mean income tax. And then the bottom one's the total income tax. And so in this case, again, blue is the original data and the yellow is the synthetic data. And so they match up actually pretty well. So that's not too bad. And the disclosure risks we also measured by identity and attribute and found that they were within the limitations of IRS. So I said this was going to be about maybe 10-year project, and you're wondering, why is that going to be 10 years? Well, this was the supplemental, so the non-filer data. We're now working on the full tax return data, and you can imagine that is very, very challenging. Why are we still motivated by this? Well, again, Urban Institute and many other institutions who use that, what they call the public use file, to figure out the projections of why these new tax policies are going to affect the citizens, or excuse me, not citizens, people who reside within the United States. Why is that so important? Well, because of computation, because of these lots of data being gathered, because we now live in this age of social media and cell phone tracking and everything, IRS is actually threatening to shut down the public use file because they're afraid that people will still be identified. So that's terrifying because we're not going to be able to make better public policy decisions from that. So if we can figure out a way to still release that very useful information, that public use file, in a private way, privacy preserving way, again, balancing utility and privacy here, then we can continue to do this very important work. So again, the full tax return data, that's going to take a long time. And then there's even an extension after that where we can go into discussion if we have time, but that's going to add another like 3 to 5 year work. So this is why it's such a long process. So in summary, we talked about what data privacy is, data synthesis, which is a very popular method now, gaining more popularity, differential privacy, which is why I was saying like all the big tech companies doing it, federal agencies are doing it, why not you? Differentially private data synthesis, what does that mean? How do we combine the two, and how they're like in roughly 2 categories, non-parametric and parametric, and they both have pros and cons. Some of the challenges that we face, which the big one I'm highlighting here because I'm really big on scientific communication, is the fact that it's just not very accessible and we don't have enough information out there. And then some of the work I'm doing at Urban. So we have, I guess, 30 minutes, unless you guys don't want to hear me talk anymore, or like have a open conversation. Any questions that you might have, like, I guess, ask me anything, AMA.
Sure. Yeah, so one question, it's around how can people help, right? So we learned from you that there's some challenges related to the sheer cost of being able to have the right environments, capturing data, making that data usable, and things like that. But for someone, I guess for both people that are highly technical and motivated and in the field, how can they contribute? And how would you say the average person can contribute to make sure that a project like this one is successful, so that we can potentially have better public policy being passed by our politicians?
Right. So I'm going to answer the latter one, which is like, how can the average person help contribute to this public policy decisions? And the easiest one is to vote. You should vote for somebody who thinks about this. There was actually a potential, I'm going to totally mess this up, bill proposed by 3 senators, and I can't even think because everybody's names is just bundling together, but there's 3 senators who are going to address a bill that says, hey, we do need to collect data on COVID for COVID-19, but if this passes, then companies who collect the data have to delete it after so many months after the crisis is over. So it was looking into the whole, yes, it's important that we should look into this and we should collect it, but there should be certain policies in place on how the data should be stored, what are the precautions, and then it has to be permanently deleted later. So knowing those senators or knowing people who think about these things, you should definitely vote for them. And it's actually sad that the United States hasn't moved forward on this, considering that in Europe they have. So like all those notices you get every so often, it's like, we're updating our public policy because of our privacy. Yeah, so it's good that companies are doing this, but we should have more laws enacted in the United States in particular. So that's definitely one. For those who are more technical, I cannot stress this enough, there is not enough of us researching in this area. Like, there are so many problems and not enough people. So actually, that was one of the comments I frequently receive when I give these talks, is that, Claire, you're just spreading all these ideas and just saying like, we could research this area or this area. Aren't you afraid someone's going to scoop you? I was like, there's just not enough of us. And particularly in statistics, there's far more people in computer science who research this area, but we still need more. And we also need more people to think, I shouldn't say think differently, but that's the best way I can think about, or think about it. So generally in computer science, a lot of it is, the bulk of it has been in theory. And so the research area is like pretty much like hitting that fully mature level of research of being in theory. But as I mentioned before, there's not enough use cases and applications. And so we can't rely on only just statisticians or just some of the computer scientists who do it. We need lots of people to contribute and to say like, hey, we found out with this rural economic data, like the one I'm doing for BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is what we found for small economy areas. This is what we do. And it's publishable work. Why? Because nobody has done it yet. Isn't that crazy? Who hasn't done this yet? I don't know why. It's an important topic. So we just need more and more people. So I I highly encourage, if you have burning questions, if you really want to come in this area, here's my email. Email me. I am more than happy to talk more with you. We can be friends. I mean, I think I'm a pretty friendly person. So I even thought about like co-advising somebody. Is like, if they want to do this for thesis work, yeah, sure, I'll co-advise you. We just need more people. So if you're interested, you can talk to me. I'm friendly, I think. I don't bite. I'm really small. I'm a small Asian woman. Like, really, I can't be that intimidating. More questions, concerns?
So just a follow up on that. There's a lot of research in areas of confidential computing, particularly using new techniques that maybe are not there yet in terms of scaling, like homomorphic encryption and some others. Would you be able to comment on how that research could potentially accelerate the work that you and your team and all the folks you're collaborating with are doing, or not, or just would like to hear your view on that?
Okay, so funny enough, I actually had to make a comment on this on my proposal because this foundation supports fully homomorphic encryption. And they're like, hey, why haven't you talked about this work? So the data privacy, I call it umbrella, it's like the huge field is that it's huge. And so I'm this one small part where I'm looking at generating synthetic data, assessing quality, disclosure risks, and potentially like other ways to access the data without violating privacy. So homomorphic, fully homomorphic encryption, FHE, all right, is actually in another part of that umbrella, because they're trying to figure out ways that you can access data when it's already encrypted, right, without decrypting it, if I understand correctly, because this is outside my field expertise, so I only peripherally understand it. So I think it's great that we're all pushing the boundary, which I call the boundary of knowledge. So we're all pushing against it, trying to expand it, and so maybe we will overlap, but currently we don't overlap too much. Some of the ways I can see it overlapping is that there's some research right now with one of the foundation's proposals we applied for. There are a few groups that are trying to develop better open source software too on fully homomorphic encryption. And so maybe some of their techniques on speeding up their processes we can use to speed up ours. So that's where I can see potentially where we can collaborate between. It's just the fact that better coding, maybe we can optimize on GPUs a little bit better, so on and so forth. So that's the link, but right now they're not quite crossed paths yet. So.
Got it. And maybe one last question for me. So you mentioned this project is a fairly lengthy, right? It'll be over a long, up to 10 years. What other areas that are not synthetic tax return data are also primed for this type of research that you just don't have the time or the resources to be able to focus on now?
Yeah, so it's this project. I said 10 because I think it's going to be a 10. I think one of my collaborators thinks it's going to be shorter because it's 3 years on the non-file, 3 years on the full, and another 3 years for mysterious future work that I might talk about later. So that's roughly 9, right? Okay, so I apologize. That was my beagle, and he's very loud. Beagles are loud. So moving on from the dogs, what data can be used? So we talked about tax return, talked about like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So there are a lot of census products that need to be worked on. So currently, not just the decennial, but Census is working on what they call the American Community Survey. And so they said they're going to try to get something out, a synthetic data set by 2025. So that still doesn't fully answer your question, but it's an example of another data product. Other ones that you can think about are, I didn't highlight social network data. So there is very little research in that in general. I mean, you'll still see people publishing it because it's still, wow, social networks, so cool, right? We have Facebook, Twitter, that's social media. Oh, what about, we can look at clustering of people, like maybe they emailed each other, or maybe they have a certain kind of relationship. Like there's, what is the classic data? Is like the monk data set, like monks who are friendly, like because they chat. I don't know. That's one of the classic data sets. Other one is the Enron data set, where people are exchanging emails and what from different departments and levels. Anyways, so social network data is really hard because not only are you trying to preserve maybe the attributes, what I was saying, like gender, age, income, so on and so forth, but you have to try to figure out how to preserve the relationships, the edges of the social network. Other data sets are difficult. Longitudinal is what we call it in statistics, but I believe in economics, they call it panel data or just temporal data. So data over time is very hard to figure out that trade-off. And so we need more research in that. Spatial, we need more spatial. It's just hard because like what if you're looking at poor little Claire in Salmon, Idaho, right? So that location, like how do you protect someone? Those are the big ones right now I can think of. So those are kind of general overarching data types, but you can imagine like there's could be a lot underneath, like we were talking, I say we, so the data science team was talking to certain cities across the nation to try to do like what they call tequity, so equal tech. And they do a lot of surveys. So like, I think it was one of the cities was Kansas City. They do surveys and they wanted to figure out a way to empower and show the citizens what they've been using the collecting that data for, and they could use it for maybe like other projects that they want more localized in the city, but at the same time you can't know who answered what in the survey, so they're trying to figure out that part of their, again, tequity. I think that's kind of fun.
Got it. Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Are there any other questions that have come up? If not, I'd like to thank you along all the other co-hosts of this meetup for joining us today. This was very insightful, and we'll be sharing the video afterwards to make sure that other people can also discover it. So thanks again for joining us. I don't know if anyone else want to add some words.
Thank you, Claire.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it was super interesting. I really just appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting conversation.
Oh, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it, or you guys are super nice. So I appreciate the kind words.
And on behalf of PyLady Southwest Florida, thank you, Claire. I actually, I will take you up on your offer to contact you. I have a very small case study that you might be interested in.
I have a thumbs up right now. I don't know if anybody can, because you're live streaming this for Twitch, so maybe no one sees my thumbs up. Also, I never thought about streaming this with Twitch. That's very clever.
Yeah, we're trying to, I guess, reach a broader audience, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, thanks again for joining us, and to the audience, thanks for joining us in this meetup. We look forward to learning about new things next time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Daniel, for putting it together.
Yeah, of course. I stopped. Give me 1 second.